The scariest moment of my life occurred when I was age 10 and in 4th grade. The reason I remember that so distinctly was because of the incident that happened a week before my birthday in March of the year 2003. The clarity of the 15-minute or so ordeal has stuck with me to this day, and at the time it really messed me up for about 5 years. The day in question that eventually turned into a horror story for me started off on a rather exciting note, as my parents had just informed me that, for the first time ever, I would be staying home alone for a little while since they were going off to a party until midnight, and my younger brother, who was about 9, was going to a sleepover at his friend's house a few blocks away. Now, this probably doesn't sound like much, but let me tell you, to a 4th grader, that kind of independence seems incredible. Well, evening eventually came, and I remember spending most of my night from 6 to 10 p.m. playing GameCube without my parents enforcing their usual limits. Now, before I get into the part where my night went downhill, allow me to give you some background info on where I lived at the time. My neighborhood was in southeast Michigan and was filled with mostly upper-middle-class homes and was spread out fairly spaciously. It wasn't like giant 4-acre country plots, but there was a good 100 yards in between each house, enough room for privacy but still close enough to feel like a community. Personally, I lived in a 3-level home about 4 minutes into the subdivision from a main road. So at about 10 p.m., my developing self-control told me that I should probably stop playing video games and head upstairs for some rest. So I brushed my teeth and decided to read in bed until I got tired. After about 10 minutes of reading, the chime of the doorbell suddenly snapped me out of my peaceful state. I lay in bed for a second and then cautiously walked out of my room. I stood on the landing of the top floor, peering down into the darkness of the main floor, and I jumped as the doorbell rang 2 more times. My young mind was racing, and I was thinking of all the possibilities of who this could have been. Was it my parents coming home early? No, they would have used a garage. Was it my brother's friend who lived next door? It seemed entirely too late for that. Thankfully, I didn't turn on the light to the stairway, but instead slowly started to descend the stairs. Now, my stairs are about 5 feet to the left of the front door, and when I was halfway down them, I could clearly look out the decorative half circle of glass that was at the top of the door. And what I saw gave me one of those moments when you can feel your whole body flush with hot blood as the adrenaline kicks in and your heart rate rapidly accelerates. Facing the front door were 3 masked men. I only glanced for a second, but that second is still ingrained into my memory today. All 3 masks were of a grotesque Halloween style with wiry hair sticking out in all directions on the back. In a split second, I ran back up the stairs debating what to do. This was pre-cell phone, so I couldn't call my parents, and I foolishly thought at the time that the police would be mad or wouldn't believe such a young child dialing 911. I crept into my upstairs bathroom that was directly over the front door to get another look at these masked men, and I remember shaking from fear. Sense was quickly leaving me, and I mistakenly turned on the light in the bathroom. I then crawled over to the blinds and pushed one up to get a view. The 3 men were still standing there, but now, I also saw a 4th masked person crouching underneath a large pine tree in my front yard. This person appeared to be holding an object that I didn't immediately recognize. Over the years, I've speculated that this was either a camera or a firearm, but I'll never know for sure. However, in my haste, the slot of light streaming out the window quickly caught their attention, and they all gazed up at me. I'm sure my small figure was outlined by the light, and this led them to start banging on the door and beckoning for me to come down. I stood there with tears streaming down my face, me looking down at the 4 masked figures through a gap in the blinds, and them all staring right back at me. Suddenly, they left the front door and went by the side of the house. I took this opportunity and ran to my room, turning off all the lights and huddling under my desk and hiding. All I could hear was the motion light by the sliding glass door facing my backyard clicking on and off over the next 15 minutes, but I didn't dare look outside. I just braced myself to hear pounding on the downstairs back windows, and at any moment, it felt like I would hear glass shattering and them barging inside. Crying, shivering, and not feeling safe inside my own house had to have been some of the worst 15 minutes of my life, especially at such a young age. Thankfully, after a while, the motion light shut off for good, and there was no trace of them. Eventually, my parents came home, to me, wedged in between the wall and the bed in the guest room, eyes wide with fear. I told them what had happened, and my father explained to me that there wasn't really any evidence that someone had been there or anything for the police to track. For a few years, I became super protective of my brother, and I wouldn't let him go outside alone for fear of the masked men returning. I thankfully haven't had any other encounters, but this still fucked me up pretty bad for quite a while. A couple of years ago, I was living in a small 2-bedroom apartment with just my small chihuahua and myself. For perspective, I'm a female and was 22 years old at the time. Also, the apartment I lived at was more like a large house that was separated into 3 sections. I only had one other neighbor living at these units, and he lived to my left. All the other units were vacant. Now, I'd never felt unsafe living there until this incident. To begin, I have a very definite daily routine. I leave for work at around 7:30 a.m. and usually don't get home until after 5 p.m. While I was at work, I would always leave my dog in the living room so she could lounge on the couch. In this area, there were large sliding glass doors that led to the backyard. When I would take my dog Honey out to go potty, there were large red fences that wrapped around my yard and separated it from my neighbors' yards on the left, right, and behind. Besides my one fellow renter, there were a few houses that were occupied behind me. All of the people who lived around me seemed normal and never made a lot of noise or caused any issues. So one day I went to work as usual, and after doing so, I decided to go visit my friend for a little while. When I was there, I had this odd feeling that I should wait a while before going home, so I did so and stayed a little longer than I had originally planned. When I did eventually get home, it was around 9 p.m. I opened my door and called to Honey as I normally did. She would always run up to me and jump around in excitement. This time, however, I noticed she was in her cage that I kept open. I kept calling her name, but she never responded, and I began feeling a sense of dread. I walked up to her cage and I immediately realized that she was dead. At first, I thought she died of some sort of natural cause, but then I looked up and realized that the door to the second bedroom was wide open. Now, I always kept this door closed, and I knew I hadn't opened it before work. It was at that moment that I knew that someone had been in my house. My blood ran cold, and I ran outside and stood there in shock for a minute. Wanting to hear a familiar voice, I called my father, who was luckily in town right then, and he advised me to call the cops. I did so, and when the police eventually arrived, they immediately began saying that the dog probably died of a natural cause. However, I showed them the back gate and how it was wide open, and several other clues that someone else had been there. They still didn't believe me, and wouldn't do anything else until we did an autopsy on Honey to show how she had died. Fast forward a week later, and we get the autopsy results back. She had died of blunt force trauma to the head, and whoever did it had placed her back in the cage to try and cover up and make it look like she had been sleeping. Our best guess is that someone broke in looking for me, but instead found Honey, and whoever this was only decided to kill her after she wouldn't stop barking. When a detective was sent to the apartment, he asked around all my neighbors and no one had seen or heard anything. Also, the guy who lived beside me didn't have anyone break into his apartment, so this confirmed to me that whoever had done this had malicious intent. It's been about 2 years since this incident, and the culprit was never caught. Some background info. I'm a female, and at the time of this encounter, I was about 15 or 16. I grew up in a really rich town. Mansions were common. In fact, my house was one of the smaller ones, and growing up, I was labeled poorer than most of my friends, even though I was far from poor. Anyways, this is important to the context of the story. I was driving home late one night from a friend's house. It was about 1 a.m., and since he lived on the other side of town, I had to take some windy, relatively isolated back roads to my house. It was really dark out that night, and I was blasting music and wasn't paying too close attention to the road. There were no other cars out this late, so I had the road to myself. It was a really narrow road too, so I was sort of glad that there was no one in the oncoming lane. The houses that were nearby were set far off the road, and their lights were off. All of this was normal. There was nothing to do in my town at night anyways, so it was usually pretty quiet past 9 p.m. Then I saw something that was really out of place. Up ahead, 3 homeless people, 2 men and a woman, were on the side of the road. Now, I didn't get a good look at them, but if I had to guess, they were probably in their 40s. Now, I'm calling them homeless, but I'm not sure if they actually were. They looked it though. Their clothes were filthy, old, and ripped, and none of them looked like they had showered recently. I immediately turned off my music and focused on them ahead. I remember thinking, what the hell are these people doing here? We're about an hour's drive from any major city, so I wondered why they traveled all the way here. We didn't have any sort of resources for homeless people, and it wasn't exactly the best place to go begging, as most of the people here were pretty stingy. I was just so confused. I slowed down slightly as I approached them because they were dangerously near the side of the road, and I didn't want to accidentally hit one of them. As I got closer, I thought I saw one of them move onto the road. It was very dark though, and my car has weak headlights, so I wasn't exactly sure what was going on. I then flicked on my high beam so that I could see, and what I saw caused fear to shoot throughout my body. They had spread out across the narrow road, completely blocking my path. There was nowhere for me to swerve without hitting one of them. They stood facing me, squinting. They weren't smiling creepily, and they weren't carrying any weapons that I could see, but I was still majorly freaked out. I didn't know what to do, but I didn't want to slow down or stop because I'm pretty sure that's what they wanted me to do. Some of you may call me stupid, thoughtless, or mean for what I did next, but it was the only option that I could think of. I just kept going in my lane, straight at the man who was blocking the part of the road in front of me. I didn't slow down or speed up. I just kept my speed steady at 20 miles per hour, and I didn't stop. I kept telling myself, he'll move out of the way. He's not gonna stand there and get hit. They have to be bluffing. I approached, and he still didn't budge. None of them did. I started to get nervous that they really weren't going to move out of the way, but I kept going. Eventually, at the last possible second, the man jumped out of the way, and I was able to get past their blockade. I just kept driving and didn't look back. Now I can only assume that they were trying to jump my car, and that all of this was an attempt at car theft. So this story happened back when I was in 5th grade in 2005, when I lived in western Montana. I shared a room with my 2nd grade sister, and we both slept in a king-sized bed. To describe my house a little, our room was facing the backyard but was a basement room. Basically standing up and looking out the window in my room, I was eye level with the ground outside. Up and to the left above my window, I could see onto our deck, which looked into the upstairs kitchen. Kinda confusing, but bear with me. Anyways, this particular night, my sister and I were having a sleepover, and our friend was in bed with us. When we were falling asleep at around 1 a.m., our friend woke us up to show us that a deer was on our deck. We looked out, and we all saw a silhouette on the deck. Now, deers were normal in Montana, so we laid back down. I guess my friend stayed up staring at it, because she woke us up about 5 minutes later saying that she now thought it was actually a person. Right then, we looked and we saw the shadow move a little, and now we could all clearly tell that this was a tall person's silhouette. We started freaking out, and then we saw 2 green laser lights. They were just 2 small pinpoint lights that were coming from the guy's head area. We just thought it was binoculars, and at this point, we were on high alert. Our eyes now adjusting to the darkness. We could clearly see that this was a man looking in our kitchen window. I was too scared to go tell my parents all the way upstairs and past the view of this man looking in the window. So we did the smartest thing we could think of and used my friend's cell phone to call the home phone. The house phone rang loudly, and we watched the man run full speed off the deck. As soon as he ran away, the 3 of us ran screaming upstairs and told my father. He ended up calling the cops, and they searched the streets but never found the guy. Now here's where things get weird. So just 2 weeks earlier, the town's police station sent around notices in our neighborhood telling us that a person of interest and dangerous sexual predator who had a warrant out for his arrest had been spotted in our area. I remember this because my mother, who was a bit paranoid, drove us by the address of this house on the notice one time and made us very aware of what was going on and wouldn't let us ride our bikes outside during this time. Turns out, maybe 2 or 3 months later, the same man was apprehended for the kidnappings, abuse, and murders of 2 children and their families in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, only 2-ish hours away from my house. In some of his interrogations, he confessed to stalking the kids by watching their homes at night. With what, you may ask? Night vision goggles, the same green lights that we saw that night. After some research, I also found some obscure websites that had some of his writings where he discussed living in Montana at various times, and discussed that right before killing this family, he was searching for children to kidnap. We were the same ages as the kids he kidnapped. Now, I have no proof that he was the person looking in our window, but all the evidence just adds up too perfectly for me, down to the timeline and area I lived in at the time. I won't go into whole details about his crimes. They're all over the news and you can read all about them. All I can say is that he was sick. He has alleged encrypted diaries of his crimes and supposedly filmed the tortures he committed. So all that I can say about all of this is that I consider myself blessed. If anybody would like to know more about the serial killer that was mentioned in this story, there are links in the description below.